Great. And thank you all for making time this afternoon to talk through a really important topic and a piece of, a component of the important work that we need to advance the goals of the Climate Act. What we're going to do this afternoon is talk through a really, a set of really important considerations for how we advance climate justice as part of a grid planning process. Before we get started, let me just walk through some housekeeping items just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. So today's technical conference is being recorded. We will save these slides and post them to the case 20E0197. We'll also share these slides to those of you who are in attendance today for reference if you so need them. In terms of the conversation today, we have a lot of content that we want to work through with you all. So we'd like to limit as much as we can kind of the conversation between presenters. So what we'd like you to do is leverage the chat functions within the webinar environment. So we'll ask everyone to number one, just start to introduce yourself in the chat box. So name and organization. Let's let everybody know who's in the WebEx environment today. And then when it comes to questions, we've dedicated 20 minutes to 30 minutes at the end of the technical conference to answer any questions that attendees might have and to discuss the items that are important to you. So we'd ask that throughout the conversation today, as you have questions on content that a panelist is presenting, please drop that in the Q&A box. In the event that you have any clarifying questions on content as it's being presented, raise your hand and we'll open it up for any clarifying questions. But beyond that, we'd ask for everyone to keep your mics on mute unless you're talking, and then we'll get started. So with respect to today's agenda, we're going to spend a few minutes with an introduction and an overview on the technical conference. We're going to talk a little bit more about the coordinated grid planning proceeding. And then we'll dig into perspectives on how we should think about incorporating climate and environmental justice into grid planning. Lastly, we'll dedicate time, as I mentioned, for a group discussion, answering any questions that you have, but also providing an opportunity for you to raise any additional perspectives that you might have on this topic. And then we'll wrap up. So we're aiming to work through the content over the next 2 hours. So we're looking at 5 o'clock as the end of the conference. So we'll do our best to keep on schedule and get you out on time. Okay, so before we jump in, I want to do some introductions. So as I mentioned, my name is Chris Cole, and I am a project director within the Office of Markets and Innovation within the Department of Public Service. And so my team at DPS works across the department to work on advancing energy equity and positioning the department to address the climate justice provisions of the Climate Act. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of that work probably as the conference goes on. But beyond me, I want to introduce the panelists that have joined us today. We're lucky enough to hear from 10 individuals who have extensive experience, who've done a lot of work in the areas of either grid planning or climate justice. And so let me introduce briefly Skylar Madison, who's a clean energy planning lead here at Department of Public Service. We also have Jeremy Twitchell, who is an energy research analyst at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Daniel Chu, who's a senior energy planner at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We have Raya Salter, who is a founder of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. We have Tyler Farrell, who's a senior associate in the Carbon-Free Electricity Program at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Hey, Tyler. Megan Burton, who's a senior attorney at Earth Justice. Danielle Fidler, who's a senior attorney at Earth Justice. And then we have Ian Hunt, Cassidy Smith-Hall, and Maria Jean Bushby, who are with the Columbia Climate School, who are going to talk a little bit about some research that they've done. So we want to express our gratitude for all of you for making time today to share your experience and your perspectives at this technical conference. And with that, let's jump in. So before we get into the main reason that we're here to talk about how we can think about incorporating environmental justice or climate justice considerations into grid planning, I just want to acknowledge that this conversation resides in a larger context. As you know, the Climate Act, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, I should say, sets forth our very ambitious energy and environmental goals for the state, culminating in 100% clean grid by 2040. But it also sets an expectation that this clean energy transition will be done in an equitable and a just way, right? So in that regard, the Climate Act sets forth several provisions that address climate justice. So the first is the Climate Act, as you all know, at this point created a climate justice working group and charged that working group with developing criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities. The Climate Act also sets a requirement through Section 750117 that 35% of benefits tied to clean energy or energy efficiency programmatic investments should accrue to disadvantaged communities. And so there's a goal of reaching 40% of benefits of those investments within disadvantaged communities. And then Section 7.3 requires state agencies to, number one, prioritize greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant reductions within disadvantaged communities, and also to ensure that any administrative approvals and decisions do not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. So, while we kind of think about kind of the objectives and the directives of the Climate Act, we also want to acknowledge that the advancement of a just clean energy transition, it requires us to grapple with a number of complex and challenging issues. So I think many of us on this conversation on this call have had the conversation about what is a benefit, how do we identify a burden to disadvantaged communities. As the Climate Act doesn't give us a lot of direction when it comes to those topics. So we need to engage with stakeholders and with the industry to better think through how we can address those priorities. And so that's one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this technical conference today, is to take a step back and think about what does it mean for us to truly advance climate justice through grid planning, transmission planning, which is so central to the work that we're going to do collectively to meet the Climate Act's goals. So with that, I'd like to start the panel discussions. So first up, we're going to give an overview of the coordinated grid planning proceeding. So Skylar Madison from the Department of Public Service is going to spend some time to just reorient everyone. If you're not as familiar with the CGPP, what it is, what the work entails, and ultimately, what we're hoping to achieve through that proceeding. Skylar, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Let's do it. All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'm here today to give you all a overview of the coordinated grid planning process proceeding. My name is Skylar Madison. I'm the clean energy planning lead here at DPS, and my primary role here is to lead this proceeding, which is a process that the joint utilities are carrying out to plan out the grid of the future, basically. Could we go 1 or 2 slides forward where my first slide is? Thank you. So just taking a step back, what even is transmission planning? I know people have been throwing that word around a lot. Everyone's saying transmission is the key to renewables, all that type of stuff. How do we know that, and what is transmission planning in the first place? Well, historically, transmission planning has been fairly straightforward. It's basically the process by which a utility will analyze the electrical components of a system, poles, wires, transformers, and substations, compare that against the load, the electricity demand on their system now and in the future, and see if they need to do anything to that system to make sure their system is prepared to meet the electricity load on their system. Historically, and even in New York State, going back 5, 10, 15 years, our load was fairly stable. The hardest thing to plan for was having enough generation on the hottest day of the year. But in general, the total load over the course of the year was fairly stable, and the distribution of that load and generation was fairly stable as well. So transmission planning was really more of a process of operations and maintenance of the existing system, upgrading things that are old, replacing things that are failing, and if there's any local areas that have boosted energy growth, just add a few more assets into those areas. We are not in that time frame anymore. If we could go to the next slide, I think everybody knows now that we've had a lot of changes in the world over the last 5 or 6 years, not just related to the energy system and our energy demand, but also on the supply side from a climate and clean energy perspective, especially in New York State with some of our nation leading policies and goals and laws right now. All the way back to 2019, we had the CLCPA set climate targets with specific resource targets as well for distributed solar, energy storage, and offshore wind. Those will all have an impact on where transmission lines have to go. And then in 2020, the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act really focused in on the long-term needs that are likely to arise from trying to hit the CLCPA. With electrification and renewable energy growth, we have things changing on both sides of the substation. We have demand increasing on one side from electrification, and a drastic change in where our energy is actually coming from centralized fossil power plants to distributed renewable power plants all over the state. So the AREGBA, the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth Act, pointed to the utilities and the Public Service Commission and said, we need to do some studies to figure out exactly how we're going to get to that 2040 target. So it called for an initial study called the Power Grid Study, just to give a preliminary assessment of future grid scenarios, and then added climate targets to our electric system planning. No longer was it going to be just basic system planning saying, can you, keep the lights on next year? This is a long-term system transition, and we need to get a better handle on that. And then the Public Service Commission was ordered to work with the utilities to develop a new coordinated statewide planning process that incorporated all these needs. Next slide, please. So that first step of doing that high-level analysis from the Power Grid Study showed that at least for our initial goals, it looked like we have enough transmission capacity to deliver the energy we need in 2030 and to integrate most of the renewables, give or take with a few distribution and local transmission upgrades. What that Power Grid Study did say, though, was we need to have some really strategic approaches to the long-term deployment of renewables, because there's going to be a lot more needed as our load grows, and a more strategic assessment of how to integrate the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, given the unique characteristics of that and location of that specific energy resource. So the key recommendation coming out of that study was, we need better planning methods so we have better answers, more clear answers to what do we need in the transmission system to hit these clean energy targets. Next slide, please. So it laid out a few objectives of what the planning process really has to do for us. One being not just planning for long-term policies, but still doing everything the planning processes do today. Keep the lights on, maintain local reliability, upgrade the system as needed, and plan for all the changes happening in the system on both the supply side and the demand side. Identifying all the upgrades we need to meet the CLCPA in a timely and cost-effective way. Providing actionable information to policymakers and stakeholders. We're not talking about a lot of what ifs. We're talking about very specific investment opportunities that we really need to know about so we can actually approve projects, build them, and have them be commissioned so they're actually operational to help us hit these targets. A really important piece of this whole process was to get all the utilities on the same page to start using consistent input data, assumptions, and models. We actually have 6 investor-owned utilities in the state. We have public utilities. We have municipal electric companies. We have co-ops. There's a lot of different data perspectives, forecasts out there about where the next EV will be sold, what the load growth is going to be like in any given territory. And if we have a whole bunch of different assumptions across the state, it'd be really hard to compare those assessments and figure out which one's a good investment, whether they're consistent and whether they're all leading to the same CLCPA achievement. So getting everyone on the same page was a really important step here. Another piece that we added to this planning process was to, like never before, include stakeholders in the process from the very beginning, all the way into the data selection and scenario development, to ensure that all the decisions are based on the most current information that we have. The best assumptions and the best data sometimes come from unique places, and sometimes people that haven't traditionally been as close to the processes come up with some really great ideas for how to improve. And then the final step here was to produce the full portfolio of integrated solutions, both local and bulk transmission needs. I had a slide in here that I took out about the difference between local and bulk transmission, but really you can think of it as local transmission being lower voltage projects that operate within one utility's territory, and bulk transmission needs being those that would operate between zones, usually higher voltage, usually longer distances, and much higher power. Next slide, please. So the process that we came up with was after about a year and a half, maybe even 2 years of back and forth and planning and negotiation with the utilities and the NYISO. We came up with a process that we now know as the coordinated grid planning process. The first step of that process, before we do any work even, is to establish what we're calling the EPAC, the Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council, where folks from transmission planning departments, utilities, the NYISO, other stakeholder groups, including, as required, environmental justice organizations, all come together and determine what types of scenarios we need to assess between now and the future to figure out what resources we need to meet the CLCPA. So this is an extremely important step in the process because the EPAC has a very important role in determining both scenarios, sensitivities, reviewing all the data, reviewing the outputs, and providing guidance on how to do the planning process overall. Once we had that EPAC set up, the utilities are required to follow these 6 steps to produce a final CGPP report. The first step is to collect all the data we need to build models of our electricity system so that we can run a bunch of simulations at various granularity levels, at various voltages, to figure out what type of resources we're going to need between now and the future. So a lot of this data has to come from NYSERDA, other external stakeholders or reports from the utilities themselves, and gets put into all these models so that we can run to figure out what generation assets we need, what the load forecast is going to look like, and what type of transmission ultimately is going to be needed. So we follow these steps of getting more and more specific on all these granular system models until we get to the end where we have a plan that the utilities will come up with of the least cost solution for local and bulk transmission needs and distribution needs that are required to be built to enable achievement of the CLCPA in New York State. Next slide, please. A really important clarification that I've had to make quite a few times to a lot of folks is that the CGPP is a unique process. This is not like one of NYSERDA's programs or another tariff-based program where the process leads directly to a specific project or a specific outcome or a specific set of outcomes. We're not running a procurement. The end of this is not a specific investment or a specific dollar amount. We don't have a budget to build things or buy things. The coordinated grid planning process is a study process. The final product is a report that is full of just a suite of options that are all based on the modeling scenarios that we've set up in the various modeling tools. What the CGPP tries to do is answer the question, what grid upgrades are needed to hit our zero emissions electricity goals under various assumptions for technology cost, technology availability, energy demands, a number of other things as well. And so if the future is one of these 10, 12, 15 ways, in each of those potential futures, what would you need to do on the transmission and distribution system to make the clean energy goals happen? We'll have that suite of information, all of these different options for all of these different futures, and it's going to be up to the stakeholders and the Public Service Commission to review that suite of information to figure out not just how many, but whether any or all or some of those proposals are worth investing in, which ones are most important. One of the examples I like to use is if we figured out that in all of the scenarios, we need at least, a certain amount of megawatts of new transmission capacity going into New York City, no matter what the future looks like, that looks like a pretty good investment. Our models would basically have been telling us that no matter what, you're going to need this. We might come up with a couple of other solutions that are only needed if one certain thing happens. If one type of technology gets a little bit less expensive, this one power line might be needed, but not in any of the other scenarios. That is a situation where it might be a little bit more difficult to invest in that right away, right now in this first cycle of CGPP. We're looking for those kind of slam dunk, needed under many, many scenarios type of investments to get us off and running down this kind of transmission build out path to the zero carbon goals. Next slide, please. So some really important things I wanted to call out here related to disadvantaged communities considerations, environmental justice impacts of the planning process. I know I just said we're not building anything. We have no budget. We don't know even now what's going to be selected in terms of even a proposal for what different power lines or upgrades might be necessary at various substations. But what we do know, based on other studies, is that transmission plans, especially longer term plans under an energy transition, those types of planning processes can guide future regional build outs of energy resources. I think we have some slides later on from one of the presenters that show what happened in somewhere like Texas, where an area actually proactively built out specific power lines to high renewable energy zones, and they didn't buy the renewables, they just built the power lines, but the renewables came. So it was one of those circumstances where if you build it, they will come. And so that is definitely something that we've seen to be the case around the country, that transmission planning can guide future energy investment. So that's something really important to keep in mind, where we're not necessarily building energy generation resources through this process, but we are potentially enabling certain types of resources in certain regions of development. And that's a really key takeaway here that we need to pay attention to, because those regions or those energy zones that might kind of sprout up through the investments that we make in transmission might overlap with energy communities, disadvantaged community areas, and areas with environmental justice impacts. An important piece of that, though, is that we recognize this early. The CGPP order actually directs the utilities to evaluate these types of impacts through their transmission planning process. So we're going through this whole CGPP where we're seeing, oh, this is the type of energy resources we probably need. This is what the energy demand is going to be. These are the power lines that you'll probably need to enable all of this. But the CGPP order itself directs the utilities to say, once you've done that assessment and you come out with that least cost planning solution, you need to also see what type of impacts to disadvantaged communities, what type of siting considerations there are for environmental justice communities, evaluate whether you can make small changes at low or zero cost to mitigate additional burdens or to remove existing burdens from disadvantaged communities. So we're planning ahead to kind of say, we know transmission can have these extra impacts, so make sure we're planning for these ahead of time. I also wanted to mention that while we're not, like I said, we're not investing in energy resources through this process, we're developing transmission plans that can enable certain types of futures for energy resources. Future programs such as the NYSERDA renewable energy procurements, storage procurements through both NYSERDA and the utilities, and other programs, energy efficiency programs, electrification programs, those in and of themselves still have to follow their own requirements under the CLCPA. So there's going to be multiple phases to this process where there's kind of oversight and stakeholder engagement to make sure that every step of the process we are considering the impacts of our actions and the impacts of our investments. Next slide, please. One other really key output of the CGPP goes all the way back to that initial AREGBA law back in 2020, where they called out the need to give really actionable information to both the commission and stakeholders. It's not as helpful if we just say we need this many megawatts in this location. You would immediately ask why, what were the alternatives, what led to that assessment. And so what we really need is really accurate tracking, transparency in the models, transparency in the process, and a lot of output metrics with which to compare the process and the various scenarios. So we've come up with a list of output metrics that we're going to be tracking throughout this entire process that we think we don't have any of these yet. We're not quite far enough along the process to have answers to these, but these are the types of information we'll be tracking throughout the process that we'll be providing publicly on either the DMM, our matter management system, and the EPAC website itself. We're tracking things like the total demand, which is the electrical demand in the state, total generation by resource, by zone of the state, out to 2040 for all of these modeling scenarios. I can tell you that some of our initial assessments of this are very interesting. Some of the high-level takeaways are already on the EPAC website. If you want to take a look, that's very interesting. We're also going to be looking through in the later phases of the process when we get more granular in the modeling, and we actually have to look at impacts on various individual substations, individual utility territories. We're going to start having more information about things like the megawatts and megawatt hours of load that's expected to flow through certain substations, through certain areas, how much of that is likely coming from different types of generation resources at each node. We'll be looking at the expected energy and transmission magnitude of investment, and not just the magnitude, but also the proportion of the statewide development that's likely to occur in or near disadvantaged community areas for tracking. Tracking the emissions in the model per year, so we can see that at how the emissions change over time from electricity as we decarbonize. We have a phase out schedule for the fossil fuel power plants that's provided by the model, as well as a forecast for distributed generation resources. Next slide, please. So once we have all of this information, within the next year or so, we should have the final outputs. This suite of solutions with all this great data, all these metrics, will be provided to the Public Service Commission as a utilities report from the joint utilities, and that will go under review. There will be stakeholder comment periods. There will be likely at least one, maybe even multiple technical conferences to evaluate all of this information. And then the Public Service Commission will approve all, some, none of those proposals. I doubt it would be none. I also doubt it would be all of them. But they'll be evaluating that in their time within probably a year or so. Very shortly after that report is published, we're going to restart this process. This is not the only time we're doing this. You know, lots of things can change. Federal policy is one big thing that can change between now and then. The cost of certain resources, the load forecast might change, economic development plans might change. So as these things keep changing, we need to keep baking in the current approved set of projects and then immediately start over to see if we have this now, if this is our new foundation, what else do we need given the changes we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years. So cycle 2 will be based on the results of cycle 1 of the CGPP. Everything we talked about will be baked into the future cycles. And then the transmission plans will continue to respond to the varying progress of electrification and renewable energy deployment as we proceed in the future. Next slide, please. So that was the commission's role. Now we're switching to kind of the stakeholders' role in this whole process. There's a lot of ways for stakeholders to get involved in the CGPP. I think it's a very unique and very open process we've tried to have here. One of the first things you can do is just keep attending things. You know, follow on DMM. Keep attending tech conferences like today. We have webinars and stakeholder meetings fairly regularly, and we plan to continue having those over time. We have materials that are posted on a regular basis to both the CGPP website and to DMM. You could apply to become a member of the Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council. We've also been hosting quite a few one-on-one learning sessions with myself and the team to just answer your questions. See what you want to know specifically about the coordinated grid planning process, how the models work, what software we're using, what input data we have. And we love having those. I think it really informs stakeholders and their ability to participate in the future, which makes the entire process better. And you can also engage in a more formal way by submitting comments directly to filings, as well as in a more informal way by submitting comments directly to the Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council email. And I have links at the end of this slide deck as well. We're very serious about wanting to hear from you. There is a major lack of voices, I would say, in transmission planning. Everybody seems to know that it's very important, but very few people have been able to develop that type of expertise or that type of interest and engagement to maintain through an entire, 2 to 3 year transmission planning cycle. It's not easy. It's, sometimes you're in these meetings for an hour or two and your eyes start glazing over. So it takes a certain amount of energy and motivation, but we really would love to hear from any and all of you and keep you all engaged as much as we can, because we still have questions. This is the first time we're going through this cycle, and we still want to learn more about what is important to you, what we might be missing in the process, which of this big suite of futures, 16 years is not a whole lot of time, but it's still enough time to have a lot of pathways to the future. Which pathways are more appealing to you, and why, and what do we need to consider in the long-term plans to reflect that? And importantly, and we'll hear more about this in the other speakers, how can the planning process itself, both in the process and the engagement, or the substantive modeling components, how can those be improved? I know it's probably not perfect, so something can change. What do we need to change, and what do we need to update? And feedback from all of this is going to be incorporated in upcoming filings and changes in the process. One important one that I'll mention here is that back in July, Department of Public Service staff posted a white paper on updates we might like to see to the CGPP to make it more speedy, accurate, relevant, engaging, those types of things. And that was open for comment through October. The official comment period is closed, but the thinking is ongoing about those types of changes we need to make to this process. So any of those less formal engagement techniques, phone calls, one-on-ones, emails, those are all still welcome as we engage with you all to try to get as much information as possible about what we need to do differently next time. So please continue to provide that feedback. Next slide. This is the couple of resources I wanted you all to have. There's the EPAC website, which has all of the ongoing postings for both the webinars and the data and remodeling results that we've covered so far with the EPAC, as well as 2 email addresses here that you can respond to ask any questions or provide any feedback. So that's kind of the overview of the CGPP. That's what I want to say today, and I want to leave time for the rest of our great presenters.
Excellent. Thank you, Skylar, for that in-depth overview of the CGPP. So folks, what we'll do now is we'll transition into our next set of panelists. So I'm going to introduce Jeremy Twitchell from the PNNL, and Jeremy is going to, oh, excuse me, hold on one second. I think I need to update slides.
I can share my screen if that's easier for you.
Jeremy, yeah, if you have them, why don't you go ahead and do that, and I'll make sure the updated slide deck is incorporated into the final. So thank you.
Yeah, you got it. Sorry for getting those to you late.
Nope, that's okay.
Okay, are those coming through all right?
They are.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Twitchell. I work at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'll be presenting a project we're working on called the Inclusive Transmission Planning Project. I'm actually presenting on behalf of Jennifer Yoshimura, who is our lead for this project. She was unable to make it today, so you are stuck with me. But I will try to live up to Jen's capabilities. So the problem that we saw when we started to put this project together, really two key problems. First, is I'm sure this group is all aware, as we've just heard about, energy system benefits and burdens are disproportionately distributed. I'm sure we've all seen lots of information, lots of studies coming out on that over the last few years. This is one slide that has always, or that one graphic that has always just been astounding to me, that if you live on a tribal reservation, you are 10 times more likely to not have electric service than if someone who doesn't live on a reservation. And there are still large parts of this country in the 21st century where a quarter, a third of the population still does not have access to electricity. Second problem we identified, transmission infrastructure takes a very long time to permit and build. So transmission planning is done on 2-year cycles. So we have 2 years before we even identify what we're going to build. Then we have about, on average, 6.5 years of permitting, according to the American Clean Power Associations, but there's a very long tail on that. It's very easy for a project to go to a decade or more. I have one project not far from me. It's only about a 30-mile project that is, I think, just past year 20 on the permitting process. So it takes a long time to build transmission infrastructure. So this inclusive transmission planning project, really our key hypothesis that's driving all this work is that if we collectively invest more effort in engaging the public in general and disadvantaged communities in particular in transmission planning processes, we can achieve more equitable outcomes and we can decrease those permitting times. We can get stuff done faster and more effectively. And the reason for that is just, when we're in a planning process, we have a lot more flexibility. If someone has a concern about something, if someone has an issue about something, we can run another scenario. We can consider another alternative. But by the time we've got to that permitting phase, that idea is pretty well baked. And so it's much more difficult to request a different analysis, to request a different project. At that point, the burden shifts to the interveners who have to demonstrate that this project is not the best one and they have to present the better alternatives, but a lot of interveners are not going to have the resources to do that. When we're trying to do this in the permitting process, it's complex, it's litigious, and it's expensive. It's a lot easier and a lot more effective and cost-effective, a lot more efficient to do this in the planning process. And there's a little bit of evidence out there to support this. This has been done a little bit in Europe. We've had a couple situations in the US where there was kind of like some one-off funding to improve or to increase public participation in a transmission planning process, and everyone loved it. But when that one-time funding went away, it was not continued. So it hasn't been deployed at scale in the US. But where it has been done anecdotally, we can make these positive connections that if you engage people up front, things go much more smoothly when you move into permitting. So what are we doing? What are we trying to do? First, we really want to support transmission planners, RTOs and ISOs, utilities, power marketing authorities. We want to help them understand, what are these concepts of energy equity? How do we incorporate them into the transmission planning process? We also just want to increase, public awareness and education about transmission planning in general, help equip people, help equip communities and organizations to understand what's going on and be able to provide impactful input into these planning processes. So we've got 3 tiers to this project. First, we've done some listening sessions. We heard from tribes, we heard from state agencies, we heard from community groups, we heard from transmission planners to get their unique perspectives on the challenges they see in incorporating equity considerations and increasing public participation in transmission planning. We're developing some educational materials, some research materials. We're developing some guide sheets, some kind of like one-pagers to explain, here's how the transmission planning process works, here are the opportunities to provide input. We're doing some research into understanding what are some of the particular barriers to public participation and how can we think about navigating those. And then finally, we're going to be doing some technical assistance to utilities and to transmission planning entities to help them work through the specific challenges that they encounter as they try to make their process more equitable. So a little bit of background on transmission planning, kind of set the stage for why this is a challenging endeavor. Prior to 2007, transmission planning was just kind of every utility for itself. in 2007, FERC issues Order 890 where they say, okay, transmission owners, you need to have a transparent planning process. People need to be able to see what you're doing. FERC came back, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has jurisdiction over transmission planning in most of the US. They came back in with Order 1000 in 2011, where they said, okay, we like this idea of transparent transmission planning. We're going to ask you to do it on a regional basis now. Talk to your neighbors, coordinate with your neighbors. FERC also said that in addition to these reliability transmission investments we've been making, we can also make investments in transmission projects that have an economic value that just make the grid run more efficiently, and in transmission projects that enable state objectives like renewable portfolio standards, decarbonization goals. How do we actually bring the generation resources online to enable those goals? And then FERC also set forth some principles for cost allocation of those regional transmission projects. So where there is an ISO or an RTO in place, the ISO takes on this function of being that regional transmission planning coordinator. Outside of the ISO regions, the utilities just kind of come together on an ad hoc basis and form their own organizations to serve that function. So as I mentioned again, when we do transmission planning, we're not just looking at reliability. We're not just looking at what does the grid need to keep the lights on. We're also looking at how can we make the grid run more efficiently? Are there investments we can make that will allow us to use more low-cost generation and maybe reduce our reliance on higher cost sources of energy? Public policy, what do we need to do to enable state decarbonization and renewable development goals? And then finally, multi-value projects, looking at projects that do some combination of all three of those as well, and how do we put together and analyze those different values and benefits of a project that delivers all three. So the result of this is when we're doing transmission planning, it occurs in layers. There's not just like one place that transmission planning is done. Individual utilities are planning their local transmission systems. Regional transmission planning coordinators are coordinating the individual plans of those utilities. They're bringing them together to produce that regional plan that FERC has provided. There are also interregional projects. So those regions that we saw on the last slide, talking to each other and talking about really large transmission projects that can provide benefits from one region to another. So when we're talking about transmission planning, you know, it's happening at your local utility, it's happening at a regional level, your regional coordinator is talking to other regions. So there's a lot of different places that this is happening. You can't just show up in one place and know exactly what's going on and be able to provide all your feedback. And as we've been looking at this, you know, again, developing new transmission, planning for it, permitting it's a complex process, can easily take over a decade. But throughout that process, there are opportunities for public engagement. And again, as I said before, siting and permitting right now is where that tends to happen. We're doing it at the end of the line. We've done the planning process. The utility comes out and says, this is what we want to build and where we want to build it. And people nearby are like, wait, what? You're going to build what by my house? And so we get into these litigious and complex processes. So what we're trying to do here is move that public participation further upstream. The further upstream we get, the more flexibility we have. If we can get people into the planning process when the utility is looking at alternative solutions, they can provide input on that, but they're still responding to what the utility has identified as the need. If we can push that engagement even further up to where the utility is planning, or the utility or the regional planning coordinator is deciding what they're going to study, what are the issues we're going to look at, what are the problems we see. If we can have public engagement at that point, then the utility, then the transmission planner has a lot more flexibility to consider it and to look at viable alternatives. So why should we consider equity in transmission planning? Things are changing very quickly is the short answer for that. States, the federal government are increasing the expectations on utilities and transmission planners, what they expect to come out of these plans. FERC's new transmission planning order, for example, Order 1920, is very heavy on improving the grid resilience to extreme events, requiring transmission planners to consider extreme events and how do we prepare for and respond to those. We've got state priorities for greenhouse gas emissions, grid modernization, incorporating distributed energy resources. We've got a growing number of states and the federal government that are encouraging or requiring equitable outcomes in these planning processes. And the grid we have, again, in and of itself, it's a tool, as that quote up there says, but the way we have built that tool, the processes we have relied on determine what gets built and where it gets built and how it gets built, have not considered the human impacts of that, have not considered how communities are going to be affected by that. So if we want to incorporate all these new objectives and achieve equitable outcomes, we need to look both ahead in terms of how the system we're building is affecting different groups. But we also need to look back and say, how has the system that we already built, what impacts is it having on people? So there's the 4 tenets of energy justice that really guide the work that we've been doing, guide a lot of the work in this space. And so we've been thinking through, how do these tenets of energy justice apply specifically to transmission planning? So recognition justice is about understanding who has been affected by past decisions, who is bearing the burdens and the impacts of the system that we have built, what groups have been affected by that. Procedural justice is about the decision-making process. How do we get people involved in that decision-making process? How do we franchise them to provide their input, to express their needs to the decision makers? Distributive justice, that's the forward-looking piece. As we build out this system, as we make decisions, how are those benefits and burdens being allocated across different groups? And restorative justice, that's that backward-looking piece where we have identified past injustices, existing inequities. What are we doing to remediate those? What can we do to remediate those? So looking at a few specific examples of how this might play out, some of the specific energy inequities that we might see in a transmission planning process lens, a legacy of disinvestment. Communities that have historically been underinvested in infrastructure and in both generation and delivery, transmission and distribution, that are reliant on old infrastructure. If we have more granular plans that are looking at where are these communities, how are these communities being impacted, what impacts are they bearing, we can have a forward-looking process that says, okay, how can we correct those? What types of investment are needed to replace that aging infrastructure, to correct that disinvestment? We've also looked a lot at public participation. Transmission planning is complex. Before coming to the lab, I worked as a utility commission regulator in Washington State for several years. I knew virtually nothing about transmission planning. I've been drinking from a fire hose here. So I knew this space pretty well, but transmission planning was a whole other level. It's highly complex, it's highly technical, and you can't expect someone coming off the street, someone coming in to represent a community, to be able to understand what's going on. It's not a reasonable expectation any more than you can expect a transmission planner to immediately understand a community's concerns or the injustices that a community has lived with. So there's a real need for just free-flowing information exchange, for communities to be able to talk to transmission planners about their concerns and their needs, for transmission planners to be able to talk to utilities about the requirements that they have to satisfy and what the plan has to do. But what we've found is that's complicated. We've had these listening sessions, as I mentioned. We completed a total of 8, 2 for each of those groups you see there. And what we heard is broad agreement that, yes, we think there's value here. We want people to be more involved. Transmission planners want to hear from communities. They want to consider equity. They want people to be happier with the outcome of the plan. But the details, the devil's in the details. Transmission planners aren't sure how to do the kind of granular planning and incorporate that kind of granular concern that communities are bringing them. Transmission planning occurs at a very broad level. So incorporating a specific community's concerns or a specific project's concerns can be challenging. State agencies aren't really sure about exactly what their role is in transmission planning or what their role is in encouraging increased public participation. Communities aren't sure how to get involved. They're not sure what to do. So again, broad agreement here that this needs to happen, not a lot of certainty about how it needs to happen. So what we're doing in this project is trying to sort through those details. We have that initial publication, Principles for Equitable Transmission Planning, that really just kind of walks through kind of a proof of concept to say, here's transmission planning, here's equity, here's the overlap, here's our Venn diagram, and here's some ways that we incorporate equity into transmission planning. We're working with utilities to provide technical assistance. We're finalizing those agreements now. And as I mentioned, we're working on some forthcoming publications that dive more into the details on participant funding mechanisms, recruiting and engaging communities in the process, and how to identify those past inequities in the transmission planning process. So with that, in case we don't have time for questions today, that's where you can find us. Be happy to connect you with any of my colleagues to dive more into depth onto this, and appreciate everyone's time. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And so there will be some time for discussion once we get through the panel. So folks, feel free to hold any questions for Jeremy, and you'll be able to raise them later on. Okay, so let's now turn the floor over to Daniel Chu, who is a senior energy planner at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Daniel, the floor is yours. And can I ask whoever's sharing the slides to advance? Or is it back to me? Okay. Well, sorry for the technical difficulty. Daniel, if you want to go ahead and take the floor while I work through the technical issue here with the slides, that'd be great.
Sure, no problem. Can you hear me?
Thank you. We can.
All right. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Daniel Chu. I am the Senior Energy Planner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. I don't have any slides here, so I think I'll just talk through it also in the interest of time. But the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a nonprofit citywide membership network linking grassroots organizations from low-income neighborhoods and communities of color in their struggle for environmental justice. We've been around for over 30 years and currently represent over 13 members in New York City. We're also one of the founders and steering committee members of New York Renews, which is one of the main forces behind the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and continue to serve, our executive director, Eddie, continues to serve on the Climate Justice Working Group. In relevance to today's topic on coordinated grid planning, we're also a founder and member of the Peak Coalition, which is a campaign to end the long-standing pollution burden from fossil fuel-fired power plants and their negative effects on New York City's most climate vulnerable people, alongside New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Clean Energy Group up in Vermont, UPROS in Sunset Park, and the Point CDC in Hunts Point. NEJA and our CBO partners serve over 1 million residents, approximately 80% of whom identify as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, and 25% of whom live below the poverty line. Also, approximately 750,000 New Yorkers live within a half mile of a peaker power plant, 78% of whom are low income or people of color. These include disadvantaged communities as defined by New York State. And the relevance to this is that on the hottest days of summer, peaker power plants contribute up to a third of NOx emissions in our state because they're so old, so inefficient, and over the course between 2010 and 2019, that costs approximately $450 million a year to ratepayers, even though they typically run 15% of the time or less. And this is something that the Department of Environmental Conservation tried to tackle with the peaker rule for ozone seasons, but some has been extended based on NISO's resource deficiency findings. So Gowanus and Arrows, which are two peaker power plants located in Sunset Park, have had their permits extended beyond 2025 by at least 2 years at the moment, which is problematic and something that transmission can help prevent in the future. Peak Coalition has published many articles and papers on sort of the benefits of transmission and importance of transmission in regards to renewables and energy storage, like our Fossil Fuel Endgame 2.0 that was released in January of this year, and the Demanding a Better Grid paper that was released in October of this year that you can find on our website. But I think one of the most important point that I want to sort of laid out here is that the coordinated grid planning process, or the CGPP process, needs to comply with the CLCPA, and there is a need for proportionate investments and benefits to disadvantaged communities. But the question is, like, how does transmission build out proportionally benefit disadvantaged communities? One way to look at this, I think, is through understanding where transmission is needed the most. And there are two places where I think transmission could have a significant impact. One is distribution networks where peaker plants exist. And the second is where distribution networks that have experienced high number of demand response calls. And oftentimes those two are sort of correlated geographically. So on the first point of distributed networks where peakers exist, obviously, as I mentioned, peakers are some of the oldest, costliest, most polluting assets, but because they also run that not that often, they can also be phased out easier than baseload power plants. And that having a more integrated transmission network reduces the need for peakers to turn to prevent specific blackouts or brownouts from happening at a distribution level and mitigate any supply constraints, such as keeping Gowanus and Narrows on beyond the DEC's peaker rule. It could also reduce NYSERDA's reliability needs analysis and reliability gap challenges by distributing energy more equitably throughout the state and ensuring that there is no transmission gaps, or as folks on this call should probably know about the sort of tail two grids that planners in New York's energy landscape are intimately familiar with between downstate and upstate, and ensures that energy storage and renewables can be effectively replaced, used as replacements towards fossil fuel power. And on the sort of question or the benefits of demand response calls, the cost of utilities has been a significant issue, especially in low-income households that pay a disproportionately large share of their income on utilities. Transmission upgrades could help inform metrics on gaps between transmission robustness and support system integration that reduces the need for low transmission communities with high demand response calls, or the possibility that they rely on backup generations that increases population pollution. So thinking about communities that has a high number of demand response events, either system-wide or on the distribution level, and thinking about where sort of upgrades could reduce or reduce the number that times that they have to respond to demand response calls, but also how can we maximize sort of ratepayer benefits through demand response events under the transmission upgrade process. I think the key here is that we want to eliminate the gap between distribution network constraints and system constraints and reduce reliance on aggregators and enable a kilowatt level tracking for scaling utility bill benefits. This means that we want to, through transmission planning, match system-wide DR with distribution network demand response and encourage both dual enrollment and eliminate barriers to enrollment on both sides of the process. And transmission could really help with demand side management because grid planning that prioritizes electrifying resources over new large load interconnections such as data centers or artificial intelligence operations or cryptocurrency mining operations can make sure that disadvantaged communities that are undergoing the electrification process can reap most of the benefits from a coordinated grid planning process. At the same time, the sort of distribution of transmission or the build out of transmission in electrifying communities must also prioritize disadvantaged communities that are electrifying first place. And that transmission planning should also match gas phase outs at the same time. So not just electrification, but also various sorts of gas phase outs in different types of properties, thinking about New York's rule that a lot of new buildings cannot use gas beyond 2027, and planning for those buildings will be constructed and built. And also one of the benefits I think recently that we found through the draft Grid of the Future proceeding at DPS is that there are potentially 8 gigawatts of demand flexibility potential in New York State by 2040. Utilities that need to think about where does grid to vehicle to grid charging, opt-out demand response systems, thermal energy networks could sort of be built within transmission buildouts in New York State. And also how upgrades to building to grid or vehicle to grid microgrids and other virtual power plants can reduce the behind the meter and front of the meter frictions in our electricity system. Lastly, I think the CGPP process should think about how the creation of new tariffs and scales DSM programs in all sorts of ways, and that the need for an energy demand audit and a more careful look at end-use consumption, prioritizing social welfare and productive uses that actually improve lives of everyday New Yorkers is sort of a key priority for NEJA and the communities that we serve. I think that is all I have to say.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And just a reminder for attendees, if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, or if you want to raise a topic based on the conversation that you're hearing, please drop it into the Q&A chat, and then we'll tee it up for discussion later this afternoon. Okay, so now I'd like to turn the floor over to Raya Salter from the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center and Tyler Frell from the Rocky Mountain Institute. Raya, I'll give you the floor. Just let me know when you're ready to advance the slides and you'll be all set. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you to staff, my co-panelists, excellent presentations that preceded me, and everybody who is watching this today. So I am Raya Salter. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. All right, I'll keep it moving. Executive Director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. We are a current EPAC member, and we are a energy justice think tank. We're focused on how can we have equitable, community first, and community forward, clean and green infrastructure that is community informed and community led. Next slide, please. And as part of that, we also convene the Energy Justice Alliance, which is a grassroots coalition featuring BIPOC leaders throughout New York State and particularly in Westchester County. Next slide, please. Also, you'll hear a bit later from Tyler, who is the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center technical advisor for this EPAC transmission planning proceeding. Next slide, please. So really, I just want to say a few words. We're looking at what we very well know are our mandates under the CLCPA. And the stakes here are really high. And one thing, as we look at these mandates, the legal mandate here is clear, how benefits should be prioritized. We've heard about that, from previous speakers, but I want folks to understand that this is not about a special interest group looking for a handout. In the era of electricity, this transmission and related infrastructure forms the very skeleton of economic development. And that is what we're looking at. The 40% really was an underestimate. As someone who sits on the Climate Action Council and was involved and is very heavily involved in the implementation of the CLCPA, the 40% is an underestimate of folks, urban and rural, who face energy poverty and other challenges, including our cities and towns. So our climate law acknowledges that there has been historic inequity, and there needs to be a redirection in order for our entire state to thrive. And it's also really important that folks understand the stakes here. These are generational investments in transmission to support the goals of the CLCPA. One utility alone, National Grid, has announced $35 billion of investment plans in the very near term. Those come with corresponding rate hikes. This cost will be borne by the people of New York. And we always must remember that our public service mandate is for the public interest, not the private interest. So next slide, please. We're at the key questions. So there are a number of key energy policy questions that are invoked in this proceeding, right? What will this cost and who will pay? Which stakeholders will be able to fully participate? And how does this change the utility business model? Who owns these renewables? Who will that come to the system? All of this is implicated here. What is the plan for these justice mandates? And what does it mean to assess justice and benefit in this context? We've heard previous speakers speak to this. How will frontline communities benefit, including local ownership, absent harm? Will we see fossil gas and generation and distribution system downsizing? What about RNG, hydrogen, and nuclear? Will the system capture regional transmission efficiencies? What is the role for public power? And so while these are really important energy policy decisions and discussions that need to happen, right now in this EPAC, we are having a discussion on modeling. Energy modeling. And modeling doesn't necessarily lend itself to directly answering questions like this. And that's why We have worked with RMI, with the PSC throughout this proceeding to figure out how can we rework the modeling, what can we look at that will enable us to get to the justice outcomes that we want. And again, I will turn it over to Tyler to speak more about that. But remember, this is the very backbone and skeleton of our economic development of our state in the era of electricity and now electrification. This is what we're talking about, and the stakes are high. Thank you. I will turn it over to the next slide and to my colleague, Tyler.
Great. Thanks, Raya, for that introduction. You can hear me all right. My name is Tyler Farrell. I'm a senior associate at RMI, and I've been very thankful to work with Raya over the past 12 months on the EPAC committee and help her kind of navigate all these results and kind of come up with solutions for EPAC to take forward. So like many of the presenters have discussed, transmission really is the key. So I'm going to keystone of the CLCPA in a lot of different ways, but I'm really going to focus on those two provisions at the front of our presentation, how transmission can really unlock and foster clean energy economic benefits for disadvantaged communities. And the second piece is going to be on how transmission can help reduce the historic burdens that these disadvantaged communities have felt. So getting started with this, transmission is really the keystone to unlocking clean energy's economic benefits. They can enable power sector investments, but they can also, and this is probably not something that we always discuss, but transmission can really enable industrial growth in some of these communities as well. And specifically clean industrial growth, which will need a lot of electrification. I'm sure we've all heard about the data centers, the rise of data centers, but what we really see in the next 20 years is a rise of green hydrogen, a rise of green steel, a lot of different industrial sectors. So we can move to the next slide. So focusing on the power sector investments, I actually wanted to take us outside of New York and look at another transmission planning process to show how important transmission planning is for directing these power sector investments. And the state that I'm going to look at is actually Texas. Back in the early 2000s, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones process, CREZ, was a transmission planning process that was really directing transmission towards these yellow renewable energy zones. These zones were not only world-class resources, but also was a partnership to ensure that these regions actually did want the renewables and the new wind power to come. So next slide. And what we found post the CREZ process and post the development of those red lines was this actually did lead to a significant amount of power investment. This is obvious, maybe something obvious that like when you build the transmission lines and the renewables come, but that's what we actually do see on the ground in these parts of West Texas. This is just one line from San Antonio area to West Texas. And as you can see, each of these green and yellow bubbles are wind and solar investments in that yellow region among West Texas. So next slide. And similarly, what we're seeing in New York right now is that transmission can also direct industrial growth. Some of this industrial growth going on in New York is the data centers, but other growth that we're seeing in load is the data centers and green hydrogen and semiconductor factories. And all of these all this new load growth is purposely siting themselves near these high voltage transmission lines on these maps that's identified by the orange lines. These are lines that are over 200 kV. And as you can see, sometimes even the Western New York stamp park, they're being located in disadvantaged communities as well. But the most obvious example of where we're seeing these large loads kind of connect in at the places with most transmission is the Micron New York semiconductor factory, which is a huge boon for the Syracuse area where a lot of these DAC communities, where there are a number of DAC communities. This one factory is going to lead to 6,000 jobs in upstate New York. And among the various reasons for siting a factory in a location, transmission was a big part of that. This factory is located at the heart of New York transmission system, where a number of these high voltage lines come together. alongside a lot of generation in that, just north of that area. So moving on to the next slide. So what this part of this presentation is really supposed to emphasize is that transmission planning can really direct investment and those clean energy economic benefits. And what our ask is really, and what's been talked about already in this panel, is the inclusion of these equity and justice metrics later in the process. So as we kind of go through those various options that Skylar discussed at the start, we should really plan for those equity metrics at the nodal level and really identify which of the DAC communities are going to get those clean energy benefits. Second, the inclusion of the justice mandates in the policy goals that we're trying to strive for within the process. So next slide. So the second piece of this presentation is really going to focus on how transmission can correct the historic burdens and then also ensure no additional burdens are felt on these communities. This map on the right here identifies the downstate zones in New York, Zone J and Zone K, if people that are familiar with NYISO's zoning system. And what we find is the disadvantaged communities are highlighted in blue. The black dots are all fossil power plants that are either natural gas or petroleum powered. And there's a significant amount of this fossil capacity in these communities. And what we've also identified is that across all three of the CCPG scenarios so far, there's been around 6 gigawatts of dispatchable emission-free technology located in Zone J. Some of this capacity is retrofits of those very same fossil units in downstate New York. So we go to the next slide. The risk of the reliance on these D3 units in downstate New York is that by locating the 6 gigawatts at these same facilities, there's a risk that there's a delayed retirement of the existing fossil. This technology might not be fully ready for game time, and we don't know when it will be, delaying the retirement of all these units. The second unintended impact of these new dispatchable emission-free technology is just that we just don't know what other type of infrastructure will be needed, and we don't want additional harms, whether they're new hydrogen pipelines into downstate New York or new hydrogen storage facilities. We just don't know yet, and we're not planning for that quite yet. It's not to say that we don't need these technologies. We most certainly will need some sort of dispatchable emission-free technology to get that last 10 or 20%. But it is to plan for and reduce the risk of these two things. The next slide, please. Our solution, and it's not necessarily viewed as a solution, but is scenario 7 in the CCPG planning, this no downstate DFR scenario. It is scenario 3, which is one of the state scenarios that restricts no DFRs in zone J and K. And the way we get at that is by reducing the transmission, relaxing rather, the transmission requirement from upstate New York to downstate New York to hopefully identify more transmission. Next slide. So like I said, what scenario 7 looks at is basically just a different vision for what downstate New York might look like. It's a bookend, as you could say, to compare against the core scenario. The core scenario is looking at around 6 gigawatts of downstate dispatchable emission-free resources, while our scenario is going to look at 0 gigawatts. Now, the resulting impact is that we might have more transmission from upstate to downstate New York compared to the core scenario, but we're really just awaiting those results so we can actually just at least visualize those two scenarios and those two worlds. And as Skylar already mentioned in this presentation, looking at all those options will help the New York DPS, the Commission, and New York as a whole really identify what are the transmission investments that we need to make and what are the impacts of those various different investments. And if reducing dispatchable emission-free resources to 0 and allowing for the prompt retirement of those fossil units is possible, then that might be something that the DPS and the Commission want to pursue once we get those results. So I'll go to the next slide and close this out. Just to summarize, what we're really focused on in this process is the tracking of metrics and the development, ensuring that investments and clean energy economic benefits are flowing to DAC communities across the state of New York, and that we're reducing the risk of undue burden on the DAC communities. And our three asks are, and this again, just a repetition of what we discussed, is the first one is just ensuring that those justice mandates are included in the policy goals of the entire process. We're not just planning for clean, and we're not just planning for least costs. We're also planning to meet those CLCPA justice mandates. Second, for the inclusion of the equity and justice metrics in those later phases when we get to the nodal level, and the Columbia students are going to talk about that shortly. And then finally, plan for those alternate visions, those alternate options, whether it's one with no DFERs in those disadvantaged communities, or one where the clean energy economic benefits are directed toward those disadvantaged communities, whether that comes through clean manufacturing or new power sector investments. So next slide. Thank you. I know I ran through a lot there, but we appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work as part of the CCPG process. And I'll pass it back to Chris. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Raya. Really appreciate your perspectives here. Now I'd like to introduce our next set of panelists. So Megan Burton and Danielle Fidler from Earth Justice. They'll share their perspectives on, considering climate justice in grid planning work.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Hi, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Megan Burton. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice, and my colleague Danielle Fidler is also on. Just a little brief background about Earth Justice. It's a national environmental nonprofit. We have multiple offices across the country. We operate a little bit like a law firm and represent many of our clients pro bono. Most of my work is around climate and energy in New York, while my colleague Danielle does a lot of work on the electric grid planning at the federal level. So it's before FERC and various ISOs. So today Danielle and I are going to split our time. I'm going to first dive into some of the things that I've seen at the state level, and then I'll hand it over to Danielle to talk about at the federal level. A little bit following what Jeremy said earlier, I'm still in a steep learning curve trying to get a handle on the electric grid and the transmission planning side. I've, for the past 7 or 8 years, worked more on the gas planning side in various generic dockets, as well as utility rate making proceedings in New York. And so my perspective today is like taking a couple of steps back of seeing what has worked and what hasn't worked in some of those proceedings that I just laid out, and like how members of disadvantaged communities and frontline communities and environmental justice communities have been able to meaningfully engage in some of these processes, and what have been some of the barriers. And then I was going to talk a little bit about some potential solutions or options as ways that we can improve the planning that will go forward in the coordinated grid planning proceeding. So one of the first things that I was going to talk about, or just my observation, is that there needs to be, in order to meaningfully make space and allow and enable folks from disadvantaged communities to engage, for them to have proper funding, for them to have the time and capacity to engage, I feel like there's two things that need to happen. One of them is that there just needs to be more coordination between some of the state agencies as well as large municipalities. So if we really want to ensure and meet our state's mandates of 35 to 40% investment mandates, I think that there needs to be better coordination as to what the standards are, what the analysis is, what are the benchmarks between the Department of Environmental Conservation, the PSC, Department of Transportation, NYSERDA, NYPA, as well as a lot of the other large municipalities throughout New York. Just to list a few, where we're seeing some projects being prepared or proposed, besides New York City, but also Buffalo, Syracuse, and Albany. And so is that information being exchanged? Is that being made available to members of DAC so that they can comment? And are the same metrics being used across those state agencies so that members of DACs know what they are and can engage? The second high level observation is what I've experienced. And again, this is from really rolling up my sleeves and engaging in the gas planning proceeding, which is in some ways very similar to the coordinated grid planning proceeding, where the utilities need to provide a 20-year long-term plan every 3 years. We've seen a lot of silos between staff, so that some of the proposals or some of the metrics or even some of the analyses as to how are we weighing benefits and burdens to members of disadvantaged communities aren't applied the same way in different utilities' long-term plans. We're also seeing that there's even a silo or a breakdown between DPS members of DPS and the gas planning dockets, as well as other generic proceedings that touch one another. For example, the New Efficiency New York proceeding or the Energy Affordability proceeding, as well as the trial staff working in the various utility rate cases. And so we want to make sure when we're thinking about the coordinated grid planning, how are we going to avoid that? How do we want to make sure so that we're inviting members from DACs to engage, that they feel like there's a space for them to be heard, that there's sufficient timing, and that the metrics that is either laid out in the PSC order or in technical conferences or any other guidelines is that it's actually carried out and applied. Because as Skylar mentioned earlier, a lot of these proceedings are very intensive, very technical, and take up a lot of time and space. And so really wanting to make sure that as we're asking folks from the community to engage and retain experts, that there is space for them to submit their comments on time, and that we are, as the state, holding true to Section 7.3 as well as the investment mandates. Two things that I was thinking that could potentially help with, avoiding some of these, and I apologize.
I mean, how bad could they be?
Off mute. But I was thinking that there could be a creation of some type of watchdog group or working group with or within the DPS, Department of Public Service, that actually is monitoring a lot of these CLCPA implementation proceedings, such as the gas planning, such as the coordinated grid planning, such as the rate cases, the NENI dockets, the transmission interconnection, DER, Rapid Act, large scale renewable proceedings, to ensure that members of DACs are included, and that staff from all of these various proceedings are speaking with one another and actually learning from what's working and what's not working. I think that could be tremendously helpful and beneficial, and could help, disseminate more information to members of disadvantaged communities. I also think it would be helpful to increase outreach and education. I think that this is a challenge for folks to really engage. And if you're obviously a full-time job and volunteering and wanting to engage on this, there's not always sufficient time in the day to engage and even learn about what the issues on the ground are. So I think doing some tactics of even going door to door, of holding webinars or educational or teach-in meetings could be helpful. But I think identifying where the communities that need the most investments, I think that could be very, very beneficial. So some of these teach-ins could be had at HOAs or co-ops, I think at libraries, community centers, places of worship, schools, athletic centers, because right now we're not seeing that type of outreach and community engagement where folks just don't have notice or may not have the time. And then last, before I hand it over to Danielle, I think one other thing that we need to be thinking about to avoid the silos is to ensure that we're prioritizing affordability and that we're also coordinating the investments on the electric grid side as well as on the gas distribution side. I think from what we have seen is that utility bills are dramatically going up every 3 years or even every year amongst the utilities. Those billions of dollars of needed investments, both on the gas and the electric side. We want to make sure that we're not leading to more energy insecurity. And so wanting to make sure that as we're building this needed infrastructure up, that members of DACs who are already struggling with their energy bills aren't left behind with that. And so I think it's going to require a lot of thinking outside the box, collaborating with DPS staff, and really working in the energy affordability proceeding. But I will stop there and hand it over to my colleague Danielle, and hopefully I was right on time there.
Hey, Megan, thank you. And Danielle, before you jump in, can I just remind everyone, if you're not speaking, please mute your line. There's some crosstalk happening, so please mute your line. Thank you. Danielle, back to you.
It's Kristen again. So I just wanted to echo basically everything that Megan and our panelists have been saying and put that also in the sort of federal context. And just to back up for 1 second, I think it's really important to remember that the entire existing transmission system, including the kind of existing or historical transmission planning processes, are designed from top to bottom around a fossil fuel system that has large plants located near load centers. And this is pretty much the exact opposite of what a modernized clean energy system requires, where energy is coming both from like wind farms and solar resources far away, as well as like very hyper local community solar demand response systems. So, but unless these resources can connect to the grid and compete in energy markets, we can't transition away from fossil fuels or meet new needs. So on the federal side, NYISO has its own layer of transmission planning requirements, and they are not designed to implement New York state laws. I mean, there's a, public policy planning element of it, but the transmission planning system that FERC has designed in Order 1000, and now there's a new order coming out, but historically it was not required that transmission be centered around compliance. It's something that one can consider, but it wasn't a central focus of the transmission planning. So transmission planning can and has thwarted the clean energy transition in a state like New York. And I think, as Daniel mentioned about Gowanus and Narrows, that's the most kind of blatant example. The decision to take down Indian Point happened, and folks knew that this could, in fact, increase the reliance on very dirty peaker plants. But the transmission system didn't plan to what was going to happen and build transmission to cheaper upstate resources. And so here we have, a law that folks fought for and won legislatively to shut down these plants, and then they're being overridden because the NYISO system has determined that they think there's too much risk that there will be a high peak that will require those plants to be there based on their load forecasting. And so, the relationship between the state processes and the federal processes are critically important, because you can have NYISO override state efforts without really getting together on the same page. And in addition to this, the NYISO, so you can plan all you want, but NYISO is the one that governs the interconnection queue to the regional resources. And that is very, very clogged with years-long delays. Again, because the regional this bulk transmission system, the bigger state transmission system, just doesn't have the capacity that it needs to meet the clean energy goals. I want to note just one thing about also the capacity market. I know we're talking about transmission, but the other piece of this is the resources themselves, how they get money in the system is designed around a capacity market that it's just focused on the cheapest generic unit of energy that's available 24/7, which a lot of clean resources are not. So again, there are just so many forces in the NYISO system that prioritize and give preferences to the fossil fuel system, that it makes it very difficult to transition. Participation in NYISO processes is even harder for anyone who isn't essentially a professional. You have to be a member to vote. It's expensive. Many committees have meetings with little to no technical assistance and little to no outreach to affected communities. For example, the short-term solicitation notice that said we're going to keep Gowanus and Narrows open didn't really involve any communication with the communities. So it's a really difficult situation, recognizing that these two planning processes exist. So one of the big breakthroughs is FERC just issued Order 1920. This is a new transmission planning rule that for the first time NYISO will have to plan for long-term transmission over a 20-year period that identifies transmission needs that have to meet state laws on both the load and the generation side. It's moving to what's called scenario-based planning, which we've been discussing, Skylar's been discussing in the CGP process as well, which is where you're just trying to imagine like different scenarios that can present themselves over this 20-year period. And you're trying to look at, you know, what are the law requirements? What are the weather weather impacts likely to be? What are the market trends in fuel costs, capital costs? So looking at the system holistically and planning on looking at what are the projects that offer the most benefits, including reliability, economic benefits, environmental cost benefits, access to cheaper energy benefits. So this is something that's kind of new. New York has somewhat done this, but not in the same holistic manner where they have to actually do all the transmission process planning this way. Projects then have to be selected. They will have to come up with a criteria for project selection that does identify a portfolio or number of projects that will meet the needs that are anticipated over this 20-year period, and designate a point at which they're going to make a decision as to whether or not to build them. Another piece that I think is really important in New York as well is you have to right size your local transmission projects. Part of the reason transmission costs keep going up is that there's so much built on the local level where companies have rights of first refusal and they get a guaranteed 10% rate of return. So, you know, versus regional transmission has to be competitive, and it opens up access to the system to cheaper competitors. So so this is a really important rule, but I also want to note that Order 1920 is a floor and not a ceiling. FERC said this. It was designed to kind of set transmission planning rules for mostly multi-state ISOs. This is a single state ISO, and FERC has been very clear that they expect states to have a very strong role in planning the scenarios, since they're the ones who know what the state laws require. So looking at CGPP, this is one where we especially want the CGPP process to dovetail with the Order 1920 planning process. Ideally, the CGPP process will become one of the scenarios, or the base scenario, or maybe all of the scenarios will come out of this process. We also think it should go further. We should be pushing NYISO to do holistic de-siloed planning, as others were discussing about how Texas built wind by just saying, well, we know the wind blows here, so we're going to build transmission to it before anything else is built. That's sort of economic planning and reliability planning. If you plan all those things together, you can get projects that meet all of the needs for less money. So you can kind of, you know, economies of scale. And then this final point, just to sort of just reinforce what Megan was saying, is if we do holistic planning, you can shift from this kind of comment-based scenario where, I mean, this current process where people are submitting comments, and actually have like visioning exercises. If you're coming together to plan transmission, you should be inviting the communities to be at the table making decisions. For example, like a hydrogen defer scenario isn't looking at the non GHG impacts to the community of having hydrogen, and there are traditional pollutant benefit problems from burning it as well. So bringing the communities together to decide what they want to prioritize. You can't just expect a system you're planning to automatically take down the peakers. We just saw this fail with Gowanus and Narrows. You have to start by saying, these are some of the assumptions, and you have to build in things like, we are not going to have any more peaker plants in frontline communities. So other things to think about as part of this is maybe looking at California, for example, has an MOU where they have between the California Independent System Operator, the state agencies, the commission, they agree on sharing who's going to be doing what modeling, who's going to be doing what process and when, and then they come up with a joint model that is used in all of the different proceedings that touch on transmission planning, including like building electrification. And one thing the state might want to think about is getting more direct into determining what needs to happen. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, and look forward to hearing everyone else.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Megan, for your thoughts there. Just a quick reminder to attendees. So if you do have any questions or discussion points that you want to raise during our allotted time, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll make sure we can tee those up for conversation. So now I'd like to introduce our next and last panelists for the day. Maria Jean Bushby, Cassidy Smith Hall, and Ian Hunt, all from the Columbia Climate School. You all have about 12 or so minutes, so the floor is yours. Maria,
okay,
perfect.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Chris, for organizing this, and the DPS for hosting this conference, and thank you all to the previous panelists and their amazing presentations. My name is Ian Hunt, and I am joined by my colleagues Cassidy Smith Hall and Maria Jean Bushby. We are alumni of the Columbia Climate School, and our capstone project focused on the EPAC process and energy justice. With the leadership and support of Raya Salter, we focused on 3 main research topics. First, finding pathways to integrate energy justice and equity into grid planning, including modeling processes. Second, evaluating metrics that could be applied to grid planning or used to measure equitable outcomes in order to further energy justice in New York State. And third, to look for approaches to reform certain processes within the New York Public Service Commission in order to advance procedural justice. Next, oh, nope, this slide, this is great. Our report is hosted on the Energy Justice Law and Policies website, free for view and download. So for today, we're going to do a quick overview of the challenges and recommendations that we formed for the grid planning process, and the challenges and recommendations we identified for the PSC's current framework. Next slide, please. We developed a guiding question for our research, which was what equity and justice metrics can we apply to grid planning, and what critiques can we offer the NYPSC process to ensure the distributive justice measures of the CLCPA are tangible, measurable, and ensure equity and procedural justice are integrated in the grid planning process in a meaningful way. So from March to August of 2024, our research team conducted 2 lit reviews. We viewed recordings of EPAC meetings and other public-facing materials, and we interviewed experts Raya Salter and Dr. Shelley Welton. And to describe the challenges we've identified in the process, I'm going to pass to my colleague Cassidy.
Thank you, Ian. Next slide, please. So we identified 4 major challenges in the grid planning process. First, the justice mandates in the CLCPA should be more central to the grid planning process. Second, the question of how to make the grid planning process more transparent is critical to ensure procedural justice. Third, there is a need for energy justice metrics to identify where to direct investments in the grid according to the CLCPA's justice mandate. Finally, there is also a need for energy justice metrics to measure the impacts of these investments. With these challenges in mind, we developed recommendations to advance energy justice in the grid planning process. Next slide. Our first set of recommendations focuses on grid modeling. Modeling tools are key to the grid planning process. Therefore, it's critical to ensure that justice is considered in modeling procedures. We developed 5 recommendations to incorporate justice into grid modeling. First, justice measures should be treated as inputs at the beginning of the model, a point that has long been argued by for energy justice and policy experts, including Raya Salter and Dr. Shelley Welton. This could look like incorporating certain constraints or objectives informed by energy justice metrics into the model to prioritize grid upgrades that benefit DACs. For example, in a 2024 study on grid capacity expansion in Colorado, researchers used a social vulnerability metric in modeling process to balance the objectives of grid resiliency, sustainability, and equity throughout the modeling process. Our second recommendation is that it's crucial to consider the justice implications of the various scenarios being modeled. For example, a 2023 study modeling for the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy goals by the organization Union of Concerned Scientists analyzes a low energy demand scenario with assumptions including an increase in public transportation, which would have multiple justice implications. For our third recommendation, we propose that the outcomes of the grid model be analyzed using energy justice metrics. In the same Union of Concerned Scientists study, the modelers analyzed how the results of two models would impact air pollution. Then they used the EPA's COBRA model to find the public health benefits associated with the various air pollution reduction estimates. Next slide, please. These next two recommendations on grid modeling address transparency and additional research to consider. As mentioned previously, grid modeling can be both opaque and complex. Our recommendation is to increase transparency in grid modeling by having utilities demonstrate in each EPAC meeting how the EPAC members' feedback has been incorporated into the model, and to the best of their ability, assess how this feedback has impacted the modeling outcomes. Our final recommendation is for a statewide grid hosting capacity analysis to be conducted to ensure that the state's grid infrastructure supports a just deployment of renewable energy. A 2021 study by scholars from University of California, Berkeley found that across California, there is less grid hosting capacity in environmental justice communities, especially Black communities. New York State has the tools to replicate such a study, including hosting capacity maps provided by the utilities and a map of DACs across the state developed by New York's Climate Justice Working Group. We recommend the New York PSC conduct a similar study to evaluate the distribution of grid hosting capacity across the state to ensure grid investments benefit environmental justice communities in New York and support DER projects in DACs. I'll now pass it back to Ian to discuss specific energy justice metrics we recommend, including in the grid modeling process.
Awesome. Next slide, please. Perfect. So to discuss our recommended metrics for the grid modeling process, we divided them into two groups. This slide contains metrics whose implementation would forward investments that would uplift DACs. Our first recommended metric is the pricing of project on utility bills. So if an infrastructure project is built in certain areas, we need to make sure that DACs are not solely fronting the bill themselves, but instead have the support needed to further the needed upgrades. Second, the frequency and duration of power outages is higher in EJ communities in both urban and rural areas of New York. So using these metrics would allow investments such as weatherization and other upgrades to go where they're needed, as well as de-incentivize upgrades that aren't necessarily in a community's best interest cost-wise for the results that they bring. Third, more granular metrics to identify energy burden. So decreasing energy burden is crucial to forward energy justice, and the way it's currently identified is through general income. Measuring energy burden instead through behaviors such as when high-income households introduce cooling in their homes during the summer versus low income, as shown in a paper called the Energy Equity Gap, would forward a more accurate appraisal of what households are truly suffering from energy burden. And finally, utilizing the fuel mix and ownership models of DACs would direct investments where they're needed. As renewable energy has grown cheaper, balancing fuel mixes between DACs and non-DACs has exposed disparities between homes that can afford to install rooftop solar and join solar groups, and those that cannot. So encouraging a balanced fuel mix across communities would alleviate this, as well as expanding transmission capacity in DAC areas to encourage the development of community initiatives before they are slated. Next slide, please. So these next four recommended metrics are intended to start being measured now to forward justice and equity in the future. First, measuring and compiling data surrounding the impact of renewable energy projects on disadvantaged communities. The fact that there is no official report on the positive or negative impacts on these developments on communities has been used to deprioritize DAC renewable projects out of an abundance of caution. Second, to measure the cost of natural disasters borne per household. As infrastructure repairs and resiliency measures are passed on to the ratepayer, it's going to be important to examine whether or not DACs are paying more for repairs and weatherization than affluent communities, as disasters affect DACs more intensely. Third, to measure different customer groups and their access to renewable energy through fuel mix and localized projects in order to forward a balanced fuel mix across communities. And finally, measuring the granular data to forward an energy equity gap to analyze energy burden in a way that is invisible when just measured with income, in order to compensate for households that are behaving under energy burden but are currently unidentified. And I'm now going to pass the spot to Maria to talk about recommendations for the PSC.
Great. All right. So moving on to the next slide. When it comes to PSC recommendations, our guiding question has been, how can the Public Service Commission be restructured or reformed to more effectively center justice and the implementation of the CLCPA and broader energy justice issues in order to create more equity within and access to process and local control? And with that, we'll go to the next slide. So as discussed throughout this whole, actually we'll go back one, I think. Yes, thank you. So a few challenges has been, there's been a history of utilities and financial institutions supporting each other in transactional relationships valued over clean energy justice, which includes procedural justice. As Shelley Wilton had mentioned in one of our interviews that we conducted, utilities dominate energy proceedings with their expertise and their resources, allowing them to wield outsized influence in many cases. This imbalance of power can be especially challenging due to the utility by utility case process the New York PSC utilizes. And for a group such as a DAC or DAC to have a voice in a typical PSC proceeding, they must have the resources of time and knowledge, a transmission jargon to have a strong state impact. We'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the New York PSC has a large potential for supporting equity and justice in the transition into clean energy by focusing on the inclusion of DAC communities, increasing engagement efforts, creating a rolling 2-year DAC working group specifically made for the New York PSC, and cultivating a shared mission on defined equity goals could support the New York PSC in its goals of an equitable and just energy transition. For recommendations, we developed 2 main recommendations to incorporate justice into the New York PSC process. In the next slide. All right, awesome, thank you. So, as mentioned before, DACs must be included from start to finish in a decision-making process surrounding energy or utilities to be aligned with procedural justice. As mentioned before, by creating a paid rolling 2-year DAC working group specifically tailored for the New York PSC, community members can be paid to hold word and power in consensus building processes where historically there's not been mass inclusion. In the New York PSC, there is an opportunity for growth with inclusion because of New York's own dedication towards just and reasonable rates. To ensure quote-unquote just rates, justice and equity metrics must be included in this DAC working group. Without the inclusion of these metrics, DACs will be vulnerable to harmful impacts, such as continuously being vulnerable to blackouts. And the DAC working group could support the assurance that the metrics are being utilized, as well as be a part of utility strategizing with these metrics in mind. This idea is based on California's working DAC PUC model, where potential community members can apply on the government website to become part of the working group. And I think we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So in conclusion, the pathway to a just and equitable energy transition led by New York State is more than possible. It can become a reality. Integrating energy justice and equity into grid planning, modeling processes, and the procedural processes of the New York PSC will support New York's shared goal of a cleaner and just energy future. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much to the team from the Columbia Climate School. It's great to kind of hear your recommendations and interested in digging in on those a little bit more. Okay, so maybe just a quick time check. We've got about 10 minutes or so. We don't have any questions dropped into the chat yet, but want to open up the floor for any questions or comments from the audience? Any attendees want to ask a question of any of the panelists, or to provide any additional input from yourselves in terms of priorities for how we think about environmental justice or climate justice when it comes to grid planning? I'd ask you just to raise your hand if you do have any questions or comments. Okay, so it looks like we've got a couple questions teed up. So the first will be Daiquiri. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question and direct it to whichever presenter you want to?
Happy to. Yes, this is Dr. Gudosola. I'm with the Environmental Defense Fund. I think I'll be in part building off of Maria Jean Bushby's comment, but I would really love to better understand from anyone who feels comfortable kind of answering. Like we have every one of the speakers has talked about the importance of having community input in the planning process. So I guess I just wanted to ask how people I guess what people think is the best way to incent that community participation. I think it's all well and good that the folks on this call, the folks who are like kind of in this technical space want this input, but I think it's kind of a different thing to actually incent that input from the communities that we want to speak with, and like where do folks kind of see that incentive and that ability to engage those communities coming from?
I'll jump in and respond here, just because I have done so much of this work in the community talking about this stuff. It is really, really hard. And one of the things that I think is important, and that the state has had really good success in, and that was in no small part due to Mr. Chris Cole, who's on this call, is when we actually resource, like if you're going to create a working group, it really has to be well resourced, so that the analysis and a lot of the pieces like the Climate Justice Working Group can really be served and served up for folks so that they can substantively engage, because folks just don't have time. And that's just one level. I know you're speaking to, as somebody who has had taco nights for clean energy, has given away donuts, it's hard to create a culture of engagement, but this is what we need to do and move towards.
Maya, thanks for weighing in there. Any other panelists want to express or share some thoughts on engagement and how to incentivize that engagement?
Yeah, this is Jeremy. I can take that one. As part of our inclusive transmission planning project, one of the publications that we're working on, I think it's actually the next one coming out, is compensation mechanisms for public participation. So kind of takes the point of view that because this is a desired input to the process, that this should probably be a FERC appropriated amount. This should actually be something that's in the rate base for the transmission planning entity, whether that's the ISO doing it in their operational budget or the utility doing it in their transmission rate case. There needs to be a line item in that to provide compensation. There needs to be some processes to determine, who actually represents a community, because obviously we can't pay anyone who wants to show up. So how do you allocate that funding across people who are legitimate voices for community and are expressing a community's input on a project that would affect them? So thinking through some of that is going to be in our next publication.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, it looks like Charlotte, you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and raise your question?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Fagan. I'm from National Grid. My question is, I think something that we as the, at least speaking from the utility side of things, struggle with, especially in a process like CGPP that is statewide, is a very simple question of assessing the benefits versus the burdens of utility infrastructure investments. Like, is a substation in a DAC that provides resiliency benefits and reliability benefits to the community, there's a lot of benefits with that, but there's also the burden of additional siting of infrastructure in a community. And so I guess I'm curious for folks' feedback and guidance on how utilities might consider whether it's, is siting of a solar farm in a DAC, how do we balance the benefits versus the burdens of infrastructure siting?
Do we have any panelists who want to respond to Charlotte's question? Just noting we have a few minutes left.
Yeah, I can take a quick stab, Chris, and thank you, Charlotte. I think that's like an excellent question. I think when balancing those benefits and burdens, I think some of the benefits need to be a little bit more expansive or broad, and it can't just be limited to we're providing, energy towards that community. I think maybe the utilities can look a little bit outside the box of apprenticeship, job opportunities, job training, ways so that community members around there are included in that clean energy or energy transition. And so I believe Raya also spoke about this of more economic development. And so thinking of other ways of how we can include members of that community to receiving some benefits. And I think on the burdens, really evaluating and trying to prevent additional build out of infrastructure in overburdened communities. So sometimes, unfortunately, there's a lot of pre-existing infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. I think the challenge is going to be just because it's there doesn't mean that we continue building there. And so I don't think there's a one size or one answer for everything that you just laid out, of whether that's large scale solar or a new substation. But I think those are a couple examples to think about of why are we siting it in a DAC, and is there another location where we can site it where it may be more costly, but what are the benefits and what are the burdens? Are there public health benefits or public health harms? And then also looking at the economic development and job opportunities as well. And trying to rush through that. So sorry if it wasn't very eloquent, but I know we only have a couple minutes left.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, I broadly agree with what Megan mentioned. Just want to add real quick to that is that sort of agree that it definitely varies by community, but at the same time, I think a lot of the times you have to look at how or what benefit means in this equation. So like if communities are benefiting in terms of rate reductions or long-term investments versus just temporary jobs for construction and development, like those things weigh differently in different communities. And that is a consideration that folks definitely take into account of, because some of the communities that we work with don't want additional infrastructure being built in their communities, but some actually do want more energy infrastructure or productive industrial infrastructure being built in these communities as a means to transition out the old and polluting infrastructure, at the same time provide sort of long-term career development opportunities in the same communities. I'm thinking like Hunts Point and Sunset Park, where a lot of residents are demanding actually a green reindustrialization of these neighborhoods, right? And so I think these are elements that should be taken into account of when working with communities, but also making sure that respect to sort of local needs and priorities is understood in the context.
Thank you, Daniel. So we're at the 5 o'clock hour, so we want to be mindful of everyone's schedules. Want to thank you all for taking the time today for this conversation. Just a quick plug. So prior to this technical conference, a couple of weeks ago, I think you've all seen the notice for this technical conference, and within that notice, we identified a few additional questions that we're interested in your input on. So if you haven't already and you want to, we'd love to get your input on these discussion questions. You could answer them, in writing and submit them to the case number. Skylar, you might have to help me on this one.
20E0197.
20E0197. Thanks, Skylar. And if you have any questions on how to go about doing that, just let one of us on the DPS team know. And then I also want to note, Raya dropped a link to the report developed by the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center into the chat. So those of you who are interested in that, you have access to the chat there. And what we're going to do following today is we'll summarize the discussion and the input that we received. We're going to be posting these slides online, and we'll follow back up with a summary of the priorities that we heard. So thank you all again for taking the time. Thank you for spending the afternoon to our panelists. Appreciate all the considerations you've laid out for us. And if we don't talk to you, have a nice wrap up to the year, and we'll see you all in the new year. I appreciate it. Thanks all.